All right. Good morning. It's Tuesday, and what a great day it's going to be. And looking forward to what's in store. I got this Tuesdays are my meeting days, so meet with the owners and we strategize and meet with my managers and we project out things as far as like scheduling and things like that. Just a good day. One of my closest friends who was here was one of the elders in our church years ago. Moved over to Houston, and he's come back to Birmingham now and working with us at the Stone Company. And I'm loving having him there. It's just a breath of fresh air and very exciting, man. I just love how God works and how seasons change, and so it's just good to have some friends back in town, and so we're looking forward to hanging out with them this week. And man, it's just rich. Life's good. I'm really close. My birthday's next week. I'm really close to getting all the details ready to upload the book into the publishing and all of that. My little children's book that I wrote. So looking forward to that. Get that kind of off my plate. And I've got another book to start and lots of things going on in our world. So it's where we are and looking forward to the day and everything that unfolds. And so let's just jump into some truth. We're going to be in the book of Galatians, chapter 4. We have flipped the page. It feels like we're flying through this book, maybe because it's only 6 chapters in the past few books we've been looking at, well, aside from the small letters of John, have been large. But man, this is good. This is rich. And I think we're going to learn some things today that are going to be helpful for us in the grand scheme of things. And so let's just jump into it. If you're in chapter 4, I'm just going to remind you, go ahead and stay there if that's where you are. But I want to read Galatians 3, just so we get a clear understanding of where we have gone. He has been teaching about the law and the lack of maturity that can bring, and that it was actually has a detriment if once we have come to Christ by faith, we then begin to think that we can work for our salvation. It has detrimental effects. And so he's on this tear, so to speak, of trying to explain to them why it's a silly choice to go back to that as opposed to being grounded in faith in Christ. And he reminds them in Galatians 3:26 that Christ was therefore or verse 24, therefore the law has become our guardian, right? Remember, it was our prison, it was our warden, so to speak, to lead us to Christ, to get us to where we go, hey, I want freedom at all costs. This sin thing, once I know the rules, I can't keep it. It's hard to live this way. And so he says he leads us to Christ so that we might be justified by faith, not by works, right? But now that faith has come, we're no longer under a guardian. I don't have a guardian any longer. And he says this, for you are all sons and daughters of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. Therefore, there's neither Jew nor Greek. So there's not, well, the Jews have to keep the law, the Greeks don't, or the Greeks do, and they, all of this thing. There's neither slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. All of you belong to Christ then. You are Abraham's descendants according to the promise. Now, that's the crucial introduction to where we're going. And so now he's going to kind of expand that and give us an illustration that I think is really going to be helpful to us in understanding these things. And so we're just going to read the first 6 verses. He says, now I say, as long as the heir is a child of God, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is owner of everything, but he is under guardians and managers until the day set by the Father. So we too, when we were children, were held in bondage under the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of the time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons and daughters, because you were sons. God has sent the Spirit of his sons into our hearts, crying out, Abba, Father. Let me read verse 7 too. So I need to make a change really quick. Somehow I cheated myself out of a verse. Therefore, you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. Now, that's the text. Let's break it down and let's see it unfold. First, he's saying that, hey, there is preparation to sonship. This is what he says. Now, as long as the heir is a child, right, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is owner of everything. What he's saying is, hey, the children of Israel were going to receive this promise, the promise of the land, the seed, and the blessing. And all of this is theirs, but not yet. And so he likens it unto a rite of passage, right? I don't know that we really have that here in America. Probably if we do, it's like when you turn 16, you get a car. But our culture, the American culture, doesn't make a big deal of a rite of passage. If you go and study the ancient areas of our world, like in Africa, where there's a rite of passage from tribes to become a warrior, in Indian areas and in African cultures, and even in the Jewish culture where they had there. And it's interesting. I don't, the term bar mitzvah. That's thrown around. You see it a lot, right? A bar mitzvah. That doesn't come from the scriptures, but the traditions of the Jewish people were such that this was a rite of passage. And for them, in the Jews, it was a spiritual aspect. The bar mitzvah literally means son of the commands, right? Son of the law. That's what a bar mitzvah is. Now, they make it a big party and it's all of that, but the whole deal is that they don't consider adolescence in that sense, right? I mean, today we have boys who shave, right? We got 28, 30-year-old babies, right? They look like a man, they shave, but they're still playing with baby toys, right? We've stretched this adolescence thing out, but there was a time, and it was a demarcation of 12 years old in the Jewish culture, that the boy was under tutelage and all of those things, and he had guardians, and there were those who taught him right and wrong, and those parents as well as everything. And though he was going to inherit his father's estate, he was going to have some land of his own, and he was going to do those things. It hadn't happened yet because he was still in this world. But at 12, now he's no longer obligated to keep the law because he has a guardian. Now he's going to be responsible. Now, in a sense, his sin will become his, right? His choice of how he's going to live his life. And so it was a rite of passage. And this is, I think, probably what Paul had in mind in this section. It's the same thing in royalty, right? I mean, you got these little princes running around everywhere, but yet they don't. They're going to own the kingdom. They're going to have a palace and all of those things, mansions, but not yet. Right? But there will come a time when they will. And so Paul is trying to help us understand that we can't receive his land and his inheritance yet because it's been promised, but we don't have it yet. And so this is what verse 1 and 2 says. Now, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, right? So as long as we stay under the law, we're no different than slaves or everything else. Although he is owner of everything. Israel owned the promise. It was going to come through Jesus. But he is under guardians. So it was promised in Abraham that they would have this inheritance. And then when Moses came along, there was a guardianship that was established. And it was the law that would become a tutor so that they would know right from wrong. And so the law then, because of human nature, it became its own prison. That's why Paul says, man, those things that I knew I should do, I found I didn't want to do. And those things that I knew I should do, I'm like, and so he found himself, he said, that's when I recognized I was a sinner, because the law made me realize that I am unworthy, that no matter how hard I try, I can't keep it. And even if I do keep it, I don't have the want to keep it. And so why is that? Well, because he's in that stage, just like your kids, where they don't want to do the chores that you tell them to do. They don't want to obey you. They don't want to, do those things. There's that slight aspect of rebellion. That's why you have rules. That's why one of the formal mistakes parents make when children reach high school and they panic, they start adding one more rule. And one more rule won't fix your kid. And so rules won't fix us either. And so this is the whole point of what he's saying. He said, but he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the Father, right? And so in the culture, he's an heir, but he's not going to see it until a date set by the Father. Now, the Jewish deal would have been 12. But other cultures, the Greeks had their own culture, like the Gentiles live in. They had a rite of passage. The Romans had a rite of passage. Everybody has a rite of passage in that sense, except for today's culture. And we're so nebulous in that whole thing now that we just convoluted everything. And so this is where they are. And he says, but it's a date set by the Father. So he's under guardians until the date set by the Father. Now, this is where he begins to speak about God as our Father, knew that there was going to be the law, knew that it was going to drive men to Christ and women, knew that they couldn't keep the law. And so in the ultimate deal, then the northern kingdom, the tribes of the northern kingdom in that sense, what did they do? And they fell away, and then God put them into judgment, and they went into exile. The southern kingdom lasted a little longer, but it too was rebellious and went into exile. And then as they began to come back and rebuild the walls, and they began to establish themselves, you saw that there was a level of maturity that was there. Now, it's still in Jesus' day, the law was still they were still doing the Pharisees were doing the man-made stuff. But they were done with the whole idolatry thing and the sexual perversion thing that had brought them such disgrace. And so and they're waiting for what? They're waiting for that state of manhood, from being chosen to actually be heirs and to receive all of that. And the time of that was Christ. This is what he's going to tell us. And so he says, until the date set by the Father. That's why you can read through the Old Testament and you can see and prophesy when it was that Christ was going to be. We look at that almost every Palm Sunday, because Daniel was given that understanding from the calling forth for the rebuilding of the wall of Jerusalem until the coming Messiah would be, all of these weeks. And you look at the date, and it is exact date of Palm Sunday from when Nehemiah received the word that he could rebuild the wall. And so that timeline was fixed. It's powerful when you see it that way. So he is under guardian managers until the date set by the Father. It wasn't a random date. God knew when the one that was prophesied in Genesis, the one who was going to crush the head of Satan, the same one that prophesied in Isaiah that this would happen, in Daniel, that Christ would come, the same promise that was given to Abraham, that there would be a seed that would bless all the nations, right? All of that, there was a specific date. This is what he's speaking of. So we too, verse 3. Now so that's our illustration. Now he's going to say, let's apply the illustration to you and me. So we too, when we were children, right? And he means this in a spiritual sense. When we were children, we were held in bondage under the elementary principles of the world, right? So the promise was given to Abraham. The law was set in place. And so what does that mean? We were held in bondage under what? The elementary principles of the world, right and wrong, those kind of things. So from Moses to Jesus was roughly 1,470 years, give or take, depending on whether we're going to do it from Moses' death and Jesus' birth, or from death to death, or birth to birth, or however you want to do it. It's about 1,470 years. Now, even though the law was written on our heart, that's what Paul told the Romans, right? So even that, that's why the whole world is without excuse, because we all, because of conscience, know that there is a standard, that we know morally that we're doing wrong. No one has to tell us that. And so even that general law, elementary law, puts us in a bondage, because we know that we should do better, but yet we lack the ability to do so. The elementary principles, Paul speaks of those in in Colossians 2, 1 through 20. I'm not going to go all the way through there, but he uses the very same term in verse 8. He says, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceptions in accordance with human tradition, in accordance with the elementary principles of the world. So that's, you want a definition of what are those elementary principles. Philosophies, empty deceptions in accordance with human tradition. Basically, it comes down to religion. That's what that means. Elementary, stoikion, literally is the Greek word that just means order. It means rows. It means like A, B, C, or 1 + 1 = right? That's kind of what that is. It's just elementary. It can't do anything. It's what the writer of the Hebrews would refer to as that we were way past time of drinking milk. We should be moving to meat. He's saying, hey, it's way past time to stay in the elementary things of the world. You know, the law, the moral code externally. It's time that we dive into the meat. And so this is exactly what Paul is saying back up here in Galatians 4. Verse 3. So we too, when we were children, were held in bondage under the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of the time came, I love that phrase, but because God is like, he's got our rite of passage date set, right? Christ was going to come. He was going to serve as the one who would then lead us away from the guardianship and the prison of law and move us into the sonship, which lives under the principles of the Spirit of Christ. And so this begins now to be the big divide, and this is what he's speaking of. And so he says this, but when the fullness of time came, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, meaning that Christ came in and he was like us. He was God, but also he was like us in that he had to keep the law. That was a part of the culture, and he did keep the law so that he might redeem those of us who were under the law. Now, he was fully human, but he was also our substitute. Paul tells us that in Romans chapter 8, verse 3. He says, for what the law could not do, weak as it was through the flesh, God did, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and as an offering for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, so that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. You see how these things sync up? What he's saying there is, listen, he came and he was a substitute. He kept the law, but he was under the law, and he became a curse for us. He became the sacrifice for us, the perfect sacrifice, the lamb, the spotless one, who could free us from the fact that we in our own selves could not meet the righteousness of God in that law. And so it's brilliant when you just see how the scriptures play themselves out. Now, back in Galatians, so we come to verse 5, and what does he say? So that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons and daughters. What's he saying? We might receive the true inheritance, right? And so this is his term, to redeem us, to break the curse, the bondage, to remove us from the guardianship of the law and place us into his freedom, to pave the way for our adoption. This is what he did, right? And so he uses these kind of words interchangeably, right? Adoption, sons of God, all of those things. Basically what he's saying is that we were just like infants in elementary principles of the world, learning order. That would only get us so far. We had to realize that life was beyond that. And rules, if that's all we were living by, we would never mature. And so there was the bar mitzvah, so to speak. There was now you're under the commands, but it's a rite of passage. And what he's saying is now we're in a position to receive the inheritance. We're done with elementary things. We're now being led by the Spirit, groomed by the Spirit. It's almost like we traded the tutor of the law to the tutor of grace. And so now the Spirit has come to live within inside of us. And so now the real growth happens from the inside out. Same thing that happens with a child. I mean, a child's going to follow rules as long as he's in the house. What's going to happen when he gets out of the house? If we've done our job, those laws, those rules will have settled into the internal, and then he, from within his own framework, can see how to play those things out, and he will live his life based on that. But this is where the Spirit of Christ then begins to show us how to live. So this is, he says, so that we might be redeemed, those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons and daughters. And so he says in verse 6, because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying out, Abba, Father. Now we have this connection. Now we have this internal connection that leads us, not by law, but not by rules, but now by relationship. Now the Spirit of Christ in me is compelling me to want to be like the Savior. We're free now. Now we're free to be who we were called to be, to walk in the Spirit, which we're going to deal more with as we go through that. Therefore, we are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. And he says, so quit going back to slavery. You've been freed from that. Now, that's all I got time for today. And man, tomorrow we'll pick that up. Have a great one. I'll see you then.